My name is Stefano Albertini, and I'm an immigrant. On top of that, I'm also the director of Casa Italiana Zerelli Marimo at New York University. I've had this job for about 30 years. So my main mission is that of creating a dialogue between Italy and the US on everything that has to do with culture and the arts. Today we have a very, very special evening. We talk about an author in Italian literature that is a kind of maudit, a cursed author. An author that for many years in Italy, you should not really mention. And if you did, people would look at you some sort of suspicious. The third gentleman that you see there, Franco Baldasso, experienced that because when he came to the US and asked to write a PhD dissertation here, he also got some cold shoulder and some, are you sure you really want to work on him? He did and did a great job. So Curzio Malaparte is a very controversial character. His political persuasions, activities are much debated. I find them very interesting. If you're looking to put him in a box, you will not be able to. Or to put just one label on him, it's not going to work. And I believe that that is actually the reason why we still find him so fascinating, crazy, and interesting. Because you could never box him. You could never put him in one place. Of course, he starts writing during fascism, and he writes for fascist newspapers. At the end of his career, and then I'm going to stop because they are the experts, he leaves all of his properties, including his gorgeous house in Capri, we can talk about the gorgeous ambassador, I know you don't agree, to the Chinese Communist government. So when we talk about a man of contradictions, I believe that in these two ends, you really have a sense. He was a great writer, worth reading also today. And in the States, we had the fortune that people like Franco, people like, c'è la nostra amica? Jenny, dov'è? Bene, Jenny of the Institute for Translation, that took it upon themselves to propose this author to American publishers and to find ears that were attentive. That's the reason why in the past few years, I think, Franco, how many do we have? 4 books, and one is in the making, right? He's going to tell us something. Stephen is going to tell us something about also the fortune in America. That means that if somebody wants to teach a course on these complicated, complex author now in any American or British or English-speaking university, now they can because they have the books. One of the books, and then I'm going to really stop, is Technique of a Coup d'etat. It spiked the sales after January 6th, as you can imagine, because everybody wanted to know, was that a coup d'etat? And you don't really have many definitions of it, right? But if you look for a definition in the Malaparte's book, you're out of luck. Because even there is a sense of the complexity of what makes and doesn't make a coup d'etat. My job is done because you have a great moderator of our panel, our professor Andrea Capra, but it's my great pleasure to welcome him for the first time to the stage of Casa Italiana as a faculty in the Department of Italian Studies. And here there is the chair of the department, Eugenio Refini, and Andrea is going to start his position here at NYU in the fall. We are delighted to have you, and I'm happy. Please, please. And I am very happy we have already started to exploit you even before you're paid from us. Andrea studied from Berlin to Paris to Stanford. He's now a fellow in postdoc at Princeton University. And as I told you, he's going to start here. He's going to introduce the other guests. As you know, since the COVID times, one good thing that stayed is that we're very brief in the bios because you go to our website, click, and you're going to know everything about our guests. I'm very excited about this, to hear about Ambassador and his biography of Malaparte. And stay, enjoy, ask questions, make comments. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I'm quite, it's humbling, it's honoring to be speaking in front of this audience, first time from this stage. Before I introduce today's panelists, I would like to thank a number of people who made this event possible. First and foremost, of course, I need to thank Eugenio Refini as the chair of the Department of Italian Studies here, and Stefano Albertini as the director of Casa Italiana, along with Giulia Canziani and Usame for their invaluable support in making Maurizio's visit possible. I would also like to thank the Italian Consul General Fabrizio Di Michele for his support, and of course Deputy Consul General Cesare Bieller. It's been really a pleasure working with the two of you for this event. I also would like to thank some people at the New York Review of Books who have been supportive of not only translating Malaparte, Kaputt, The Skin, Diary of a Foreigner in Paris, and now, of course, Maurizio Serra's biography. And in particular, I would like to thank Nicholas During and Linda Hollick from New York Review of Books. It is really my great pleasure to be introducing Maurizio Serra to NYU. Maurizio Serra is a diplomat, historian, writer. Following postings in West Berlin, Moscow, and London, he served as the Italian ambassador to UNESCO in Paris and to the United Nations in Geneva. The recipient of numerous awards, in 2020, Serra became the first Italian elected to the Académie Française. Serra is author of several impeccably researched and written books on topics ranging from Vichy's France to, most recently, the Munich Agreement of 1938. Among his books, which are many, I would like to mention L'Esteta Armato, Il poeta condottiero nell'Europa degli anni 30, which is perhaps my favorite work of his. Everyone in the room is aware that he authored a splendid biography of Curzio Malaparte, which in 2011, by the way, won the Prix Goncourt for the biography, and the Prix Casanova as well. The text is now translated for New York Review of Books by Stephen Twilley. Serra also wrote a biography of Italo Svevo, Antivita di Italo Svevo, and one of Gabriele D'Annunzio, L'immaginifico, Vita di Gabriele D'Annunzio, which won the Prix Chateaubriand. Not only Serra wrote some splendid biographies, he also wrote two novels, Amori diplomatici and the 2023 Visiteur, which I gather is about to be published in the Italian translation as well. Other than through his professional and literary accomplishments, I also want to introduce to our audience tonight Maurizio Serra as a true gentleman. It was in 2018 when I, in my second year of doctoral... 18. It was in 2018, in my second year of doctoral studies. I have an email transcript. Anyway, so it was sometime between 2017 and 2018.
The 21st century.
Exactly. In the 21st century, Andrea Capra wrote to Maurizio Serra a cold email, as Andrea Capra had begun working on Curzio Malaparte during his doctorate. Serra took the time to respond to a perfect stranger with perfect kindness. From there began an exchange that over the years has evolved into a genuine friendship. And it is my delight to welcome you, Maurizio, today to Casa Italiana and New York University for a conversation around your book, Malaparte, a biography. It's also a great privilege to have with us tonight Serra's translator, Stephen Twilley. Stephen Twilley is a production editor at the University of Chicago Press and a literary translator. His published translations include Giuseppe Tommasi di Lampedusa's The Professor and the Siren, Curzio Malaparte's Diary of a Foreigner in Paris, and most recently, of course, Maurizio Serra's Malaparte, a biography. I'm also delighted to introduce my friend and colleague, Franco Baldasso, a scholar of Malaparte who will be joining us in conversation tonight. Franco Baldasso is assistant professor and director of the Italian program at Bard College. He's fellow of the American Academy in Rome after receiving the 2019 Rome Prize for Modern Italian Studies. His most recent monograph is Against Redemption, Democracy, Memory, and Literature in Post-Fascist Italy, published in 2022 by Fordham University Press, which received the Helen and Howard Marraro Prize in Italian History. Baldasso has also published many books in Italian. Il cerchio di gesso, Primo Levi, narratore e testimone, Curzio Malaparte, La letteratura crudele, Kaputt, La pelle e la caduta della civiltà europea, and co-authored L'età di Whitman e L'esilio, L'America inedita di Paolo Milano, as well as Eredità culturale e Memoria dei totalitarismi. Please join me in welcoming tonight's guests. So tonight we will be engaging in a conversation with Maurizio just to give you an idea of how the event is going to take place. Maurizio and I will converse for maybe a few minutes and then we will open it up to our two fellow co-panelists, Franco and Steven. So Maurizio, this is an interesting moment to be thinking about Curzio Malaparte. But before we get to that, why don't you tell us a little bit about this really strange man?
Yes, thank you, Andrea. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, don't worry. The Communist Chinese Party never set foot on Casa Marta in Capri. The family appealed against it. Italian style, it went on for decades. And finally, the heirs are firmly in the hand of the house, and the house is theirs. Having said so, well, the reasons are, first of all, the most important reason is a preferred reason for a writer. That is that a publisher commissioned the book to me and paid it very well. So as you understand, that was one reason to which a writer is particularly sensitive. Having said so, I thought that Malaparte has many reasons still to be disliked, as I say at the beginning of the book, but even if he is disliked, a vibrant, interesting, and extremely stimulating character in the gallery of the 20th century, of the first half of the 20th century. And I would say briefly for three reasons. The first is that he's a true cosmopolitan writer. That is, he's a writer whose sensitivities, whose acumen, whose capacity of understanding with extraordinary finesse and talent the movement of his time. And this time is mainly between the First and the Second World War. In fact, he started so early, he was 16 in the First World War, that his problem after the Second World War, when he was in his 50s, was that he has said most of what he had to say. And this is something that may understand also the bitterness of the end of Malaparte. We may come back to that. The second reason, besides being cosmopolitan, is that, as I say, is a true representative of that generation of esteti armati, of armed estate, that a state with weapons or with a weapon of their mind and of literature. As George always say, when intellectuals come to the rifle, it's almost always very bad. He witnessed that in the Spanish Civil War. He is really at the forefront of that movement that we can witness today as some nostalgia, but at the same time understanding the limits of the epoch it was meant to design, that nevertheless has been the last great moment of, I would say, European culture in the 20th century. The third reason is that it touches even today, and this is probably the reason why New York Review of Books has decided to print or reissue or have new translation of a certain number of his works, 4, I think, isn't it still? And at the same time has been interested in this biography, because there are many elements that allow us to consider him fully our contemporary. I would say that he has suffered, as sometimes writers and artists have, an eclipse in the second part of the 20th century, where indeed he was forgotten, or I would say cursed, for reasons on which we return, partly his own responsibility, his own narcissistic personality, and partly the fate of history. And now he's coming back. He's coming back in France, he's coming back in Germany, he's coming back in Italy. Adelphi, one of the best Italian publishers, has started practically to publish his entire works in meticulously commented and edited editions. So we have a revival, and I'm glad, obviously, that modest biography can be part of it.
Maurizio, I found the opening sentence of your book quite striking. You write, I quote, "There are many reasons, all of them excellent, to not like him." What are some of these reasons? Because you gave us why we should care about Malaparte, but give us a little bit of the gossip here and the truth of why people may have not liked Malaparte.
Because he was an unconventional, which might have been the case for many other writers and artists, extremely individualistic, extremely narcissistic personality, with a strange mixture of attraction for events and people and a sort of coldness, in a way something which we may consider in general stereotype un-Italian coldness in personal relations. And also, he had an extraordinary capacity of quarreling with everybody. So
it's a good skill.
Yes. So you will find. I had the opportunity to get in touch with some of the very last witnesses. The book, after all, was started a few years ago, and these witnesses were all still around. And they have an extraordinary difficulty keeping up with him till the end. Somebody did, but they were the minority. Also, I have to say one thing, going back to what Stefano Albertini has so cleverly put at the beginning of his intervention. And by the way, I take the opportunity to thank you and to thank Eugenio and everybody else who has been mentioned. Needless to say, to be here. There is one point that you mentioned, which is extremely important, and goes back to the climate in Italy after the Second World War. So many intellectuals, don't forget that the fascist regime lasted over 20 years in Italy, and therefore so many intellectuals were, in one way or the other, involved. That somebody who, instead of hiding like others did his responsibility, accentuated them in a sort of, again, narcissistic, vitalistic mood, and saying, I am the scapegoat of an entire nation, has created that mood, of which he has been at the same time the protagonist and the victim.
So this is also something. That connects to my next question. So Malaparte has been defined the charmeleon of Italian literature, a very complicated and complex man. Malaparte is considered to be a man for all seasons and also for no season. But your biography tries to really underline the coherence of the man, which I find commendable. In particular, you write about, I quote, a certain will to strength that is a guiding light of his existence. Could you tell us a little bit more?
They are all the embodiment in Italy, like in Germany, France, United States as an our tradition, but nevertheless, even in the United States, the epitome of Nietzsche's Übermensch, that is the idea. In Italy, dialecticized particularly through D'Annunzio's example, that the intellectual as a writer as a sort of superhuman instinct that allows his creativity to deploy, particularly where for others it would be considered incoherent. His coherence is to attract and adapt the moods of his time and transform them in what is really his sensitivity is about to teach. So that's the reason why I think that when he says in some private pages of his diary, private pages, knowing particularly that one day or the other they would be read. There is nothing less private than a diary, otherwise you'll destroy your diary. So if you leave a diary, it's for somebody to discover the diary. And when he says, I have not been a fascist communist, I've used these ideologies for the purpose of my creativity, for the purpose of my independence, for the sake of what I was trying to convey to others about the incoherence of our remaining coherent with myself. I think that this is really one of, I don't know if Franco has written the complementary book to mine in the sense that I am a biographer. He has an approach of more on the content of these themes. And I think he shared this idea that Malaparte was not particularly neither careful nor uncareful about what the feelings of the time were for him. He considered that he had a longer time to last, and that's the reason why perhaps we are here tonight.
Franco, would you like to add something on this note?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me here, because it's always a pleasure. I was a student at NYU, and coming back to this stage, okay, I'm a bit, wow, it's a lot. It's a lot because it's an opportunity to also to divulge, to talk about our passion besides the academic work, and something. Malaparte is a difficult. Character is a very difficult character in the sense of how to talk about it. I just have to say that, just following up what Maurizio said in his diary, he says there is nothing as a close to theater as a diary. So basically, he was conceiving his own diary as a theatrical piece, which sounds like a paradox. But that, if you think about what he wrote, the way he behaved, the shifting of alliances that had one coherence. Throughout his career, which is himself and the revolutionary ethos of going beyond the status quo, then you understand how many intellectuals follow this dictum of I'm going to talk about myself, I'm going to work towards like an idea of a model of me as an intellectual because of a higher ideal. We might agree, we might disagree with this kind of approach, but this is an approach that's been proved not successful, but influential for a large part of the 20th century, at least. So this is, I think, an interesting way to get started, because, again, traveling around genres, traveling around different kinds of literature was part, and even traveling around different parts of the world was what Malaparte did, and what you can find brilliantly written in this biography. And I just wanted to say something about the idea of a biography. I mean, a character like Malaparte is fascinating for so many reasons, excellent ones, and something else that is called literature that maybe might be worth taking a look at, because his books he was one of the most gifted writers of his generations, despite his difficult reception, which is an understatement. And, I would like to invite you all to read this biography just because his literature and his life are something that are very difficult to disentangle, like many other great writers of the 20th century. But something that I wanted to point out is also how to link this with the Casa Italiana at NYU from a certain perspective, because when I was a graduate student, I remember that I took this class with Tony Judd, one of the most important historians of 20th century Europe, and the title of the class was People, Performances, and Politics. Now, you can find all three in this book. It's important because his life was also a performance, an author who was performing himself as an author through and through. You can call his writing a sort of testimony to, he was a great witness of the 20th century, from Stalinist Russia to Mao Zedong to South America in the last years of his career. However, he was also aware that every testimony is not 100% innocent. And if you think about his writing as a writer who's highly conscious of how a testimony can be repeated, a witnessing can be repeated in different fashion, you understand how recreating reality through writing was one of his main goals. We might have ethical problems with that, but given the times, I think it's worth taking a look at his writing and how he developed throughout the ages, throughout his own ages. He has different ages. Even the titles of the biography are very funny and interesting, just because they talk about the shifting alliances of his career and of his life. And given that, with that in mind, you really understand how encountering a writer like that in the beautiful writing of Maurizio is also a way to open up another side of history. An history that looks like intimate, but is not intimate. Going back to my class at NYU, we were reading a lot of biographies or autobiographies of ballet dancers. Why you read? I remember one by Jerome Robbins, the great choreographer who wrote Fiddler on the Roof, and also he wrote West Side Story. Well, it's difficult to understand the 50s in America. McCarthy, if you don't deep and delve very in depth in the lives of the people who, as a homosexual like Jerome Robbins, or as part of a minority, Jerome Robbins was affiliated with the Communist Party in 50s America, had several problems and have to commit to censorship and self-censorship. These are all themes that you can find throughout the life of Malaparte in different ways. And I would just like to leave these ideas here, but again, a biography can be like a way to open doors that current historiography or more, historiography that is just based on facts and not just also on the development of facts in the life of people, just dismisses.
Franco and Maurizio, you both have been talking about Malaparte's travels. A word that comes to mind, think about travels, is translation, not just because it shares the first two consonants and a vowel, but also because today we have here Stephen Twilley, who did a meticulous and beautiful job in translating this biography. A way of books for books to travel is through translations, of course. So in this cacophony of T and R's, this is where I would like to ask Stephen if he could talk with us a little bit about the process of translating such a ponderous book. This is a 600-page plus work. No. I didn't mean to discourage the audience, but this is a ambitional audience, right? So Stephen, why don't you tell us about the translation?
Longer in the original as well. So
right, exactly.
You told me you had to cut many parts, right? Or sort of?
I'm somewhat going out of order here, but there was kind of a charge from the publisher and then an agreement, I think, from Maurizio that I had something of a free hand to try to find a way to cut for the American audience, maybe even a quarter. But I couldn't do it. So we cut the appendices and then ended up reworking some of the material back into the text. And I did cut things where it seemed to be of less interest to an American audience, or just I could not easily provide enough context in order to make it intelligible. There was maybe a small amount of repetition. So I did what I could, but I could not bear to lose any more. And this was in part a result of a negotiation. They'd hoped it to be a little bit shorter. I did my best, and then the publisher said, "Okay, let's do it." We always knew it was going to be a big book, so I did not receive the additional pressure to make it shorter. But to step back a little bit, to say a bit about the origins of the translation project and maybe even some of the rationale for it. As you've already known, that the original French came out in 2011, and then the Italian a year later, right? And at the time, there was some attention. There's Edmund White wrote a long piece in the New York Review of Books. I think there was some interest in translating it at the time, as I understand. But it was a very, in terms of Malaparte's reputation and the interest in him, it was a very different time. And so it probably seemed too detailed for an American public at the time, and there wasn't interest. So the publication prospects were dim. At the time, NYRB Books had republished the translation of Kaputt, but that was it. So go forward many years, and the interest in Malaparte has grown, and this is in no small part thanks to NYRB Classics, which, after doing Kaputt, then in 2013 brought out the unexpurgated, first bringing it back into print at all, but we're going to bring it back into print. Let's do the complete text of The Skin, and that's a book that I was involved in my capacity working as assistant editor at the publisher at the time. And that was really my introduction to the author. So that's when I kind of started having a stake in Malaparte. And then that was followed up, that was 2013 and 2018. That's when the Kremlin Ball and Jenny McPhee's translation came out. And then finally the Diary of a Foreigner in Paris that I translated that came out in 2020. So that's building up. Just there's a small canon now of Malaparte in English. With each one, more of the books are available as reference points for reviewers and commentators. And in the course of working on the diary, which, as most of you will know, is about Malaparte's time in Paris after World War II in 47 through 49, and there's a fair amount of research to be done. This was not a book that he revised; it was not published during his lifetime. Certain amount of detective work was necessary, and after a while, I found my way to the biography in French, and it was incredible research. There's the whole chapter on Malaparte's activities in this period. And as I started referring to it in French, I think it was Franco. You told me you can also read it in Italian. That's if it's because I'm a slower reader of French, so it's helpful to pass to the Italian version. And I found it very useful and quite entertaining. And then in 2020, when the diary came out, in an event sponsored by the same Casa Italiana, it was online because this was late summer, early fall, I can't remember, 2020. The kind of classic question comes up about what you're working on now, and I said, well, I would really like to translate Maurizio's commanding biography that was so useful, and not knowing if there was any actually path toward that happening, but then immediately two members of the panel, both Edmund White and Franco here, said, "Oh, I know Maurizio. I can put you in touch." And it very quickly became something that was feasible. Not to go all the kind of back and forth, but eventually pitched it to the same editor at NYRB Classics, but understood quickly that this isn't really a classic. It wouldn't be quite probably in this series, but I wanted to give him, he had in a way like the right of first refusal as being the most prominent, only publisher of Malaparte in English. But he said he was interested, that we could bring it out eventually in the other series, just NYRB Books. That's more or less how it happened, but I also just wanted to speak a moment to the why of it. And you might not think there's any more reason for a rationale because we've already established Malaparte is a fascinating writer. This is a really interesting, comprehensive book about him. And there's this new interest. But I think there's several additional reasons to have this book out there. In part because even with all the enthusiasm for Malaparte and all that writing out there, whether it's approving or disapproving, critical, raving, there are still lots and lots of errors out there. This speaking by the light of the biography. I'm not an expert. I'm a proxy expert. I like stand on Maurizio's shoulders here. I'm by default become an expert because of my work on this book. But by the light of this biography, by what I understand to be the case, so much of the writing on Malaparte is still so full of errors. Now, a lot of it is Malaparte's doing. So if you find in so many places that he participated in the March on Rome, that's Malaparte's version. And the idea that, and then the idea that he was, he quit the fascist party. again, not true that he was sent into political confinement because of anti-fascist activity. No, again, but Encyclopedia Britannica, or not to mention Wikipedia, and half the articles written about him, repeat some of these things. To Malaparte, wherever he is now, to his great delight, I'm sure. But now. The case of the March on Rome is different. I mean, that's something he later would like to forget that he said he was there. But some of these other things, clearly, in the lights of history, that make him look better. Like he's happy to have us think that he was kicked out of the party, or he quit the party, and that he was jailed for anti-fascist activity. At the same time, you read this book and you find there are other parts that put him actually in a worse light, that things that are not known that actually make Malaparte out worse in the light of history. And I think that's mostly his participation, his testimony out of the trial of the killers of Giacomo Matteotti, the socialist deputy, helping Mussolini out in a critical period. There's no defending what he did in that case. And then the other big one, if I remember correctly, is the kind of agitation and propaganda he did for the invasion of Greece when there was no good reason to do that, or any logistical possibility probably. So these two, I think, are missing from the record and don't show up. And even some of the people who should know better there's still. In respected outlets, the book forums, the TLS, there's problems. So I feel like cultural critics, writers, they need this biography. So I thought that's another reason that there's enough interest. People need the fuller story. If they're going to be writing, they should do it with this resource of this biography in English. And then finally, in addition to these errors about looking good, looking bad, if we're talking about Malaparte, getting a few things wrong is not really the most important. Like these few, if we trust that he can lie or fabricate or exaggerate and still give us some arguably higher truth or better sense of what it was like to be in Naples in this time or in Finland, I would give maybe even the critics, maybe some of them actually probably still offer brilliant interpretations, even if they get some facts wrong. But one little thing that's not a little thing that I want to point out is the sense that Malaparte is full of contradictions, and he gets these labels attached to him that he was a communist and a fascist and a Maoist and an atheist and a Protestant and a Catholic, and he was provincial and he was cosmopolitan, and all these, there's some truth in, all these, some more than others, but they lend themselves to these kind of false equivalences, as if he was all of these things equal at all times, and especially the binary, fascist communist. I think it does a disservice to readers to kind of create this false equivalence, as if this isn't so much writing about him. Says in his youth he supported Mussolini, and then his politics went to the left and he became communist. I think it's not true. There's no equivalence in those commitments. That if he was enthusiastic, if idiosyncratic fascist for 20 years, and then for political cover, Rauschreich tries to join the Communist Party when he's in his mid-40s and toward the end of his life. So I understand why publishers, others, it can make him seem more palatable to kind of downplay his role in fascism. But I think, again, it's disingenuous, does a disservice, even to readers who are going to come thinking one thing and get something else, and there'll be some cognitive dissonance in what they thought. So, and even the NYRB classics, I feel like their cover copy could use some improvement. And I say this as I'm very grateful to this publisher for allowing me to translate books by and about Malaparte, but having this resource of the biography should provide for a more honest assessment among English critics, enthusiasts, etc.
Perhaps this is a good opportunity for me to ask about the title, right? I mean, the French title, Curzio Malaparte, Vie et Légende, the Italian title, Curzio Malaparte, Vite e Leggende. Why not Curzio Malaparte, Lives and Legends? This is a question for...
This is a decision of the publisher. By Lives and Legends, in the plural, I implied, but there are so many different lives. I would say, if I may, at this stage, two things before perhaps the question of our friends here. The first one is that I applaud on everything Stephen has said, with one omission. He has done a fantastic job. I've been acquainted with many translators in many walks of my activity, and Stephen has done such a meticulous, such an inventive, such a creative work in finding the best phrasing, and sometimes in convoluted sentences, and to simplify them for the Anglo-Saxon reader, that I'm extremely indebted to him. Sometimes I hated him. For instance, I remember one issue when I talk about my visit to Casa Malaparte, and I said I entered the bathroom, the second door on my right, and he mails to me, I have a map of Casa Malaparte in front of me, the bathroom should be the third door and not the second. So you see, these are instances where an author would like really to get rid of it. But having said so, thank you, and I want publicly to express all my debt to you, you know it. Now, to go back to our friend Malaparte, I wouldn't like, particularly those among us who are not familiar with his work, to believe that everything is forgery and falseness in his Lives and Legends. Most of it is. Most of it is. But he has that extraordinary capacity to reprocess and refabricate his own truth out of his lies. Mm-hmm. And this is something which requires not only an extraordinary elasticity towards the facts of his life, but also the fact, as I said at the origins, that there is a profound coherence in the man. There is the coherence in considering that the facts, the landscapes, the personalities that he has met at times for 5 minutes, and he writes then a full chapter in Kaputt, like if he had been with them for an entire year. And so, by the way, Kaputt, who is probably the single book that encapsulates more of the war in Europe, from all the theaters, from basically Greece to Ukraine, via the war in Finland and so on, has been written in Capri. That is, he was there in minimal periods of his life, a week here and there as a correspondence. The longest has been 3 or 4 weeks. He drafted, he had an extraordinary capacity to encapsulate, to absorb what he felt and what he needed, then went back to Capri, looked at the waves of Capri and at the Faraglioni, and wrote about the evening of Governor Frank in Warsaw, or the rats, or Heydrich in the Himmler in the sauna, and so on. Because he was extremely gifted in having this capacity of seizing from the detail the general purpose. And that's the reason that makes some of his books, certainly, if not all, certainly not all, but some of his books the template of the 20th century, or at least of the first half of the 20th century.
Franco?
In fact, just to follow up to what Maurizio said, it's difficult even to teach Malaparte. I had I taught Malaparte in my classes, definitely not the first choice for a number of students. But then after reading me, they understand that we are going at the very core of the dark heart of the 20th century with his writing. It doesn't shy away from showing the worst-case scenario, just because with the worst-case scenario, you can learn a lot. Before we were discussing about biography and history, the point is exactly this: the fact of having a writer that doesn't stop, doesn't refrain, doesn't censor himself when this writer wants to go and show what really happened, which is the paradox of his writing. Very often he is inventing the facts, but the people that he met, probably he met them. I mean, here we have a biography that are certain whether or not he met them in Ukraine, in Russia, in France, and elsewhere in Europe and in the world. But besides that, we have really a writer who is able to sublimate the facts of history and give you the kernel, the core of the experience, of the worst experience of also 20th century. There are amazing pages on the dialogues between him and the Nazi in front of a beautiful buffet, or when he visited the Warsaw Ghetto. And of course, there are also letters from the Polish resistance saying, kind of praising Malaparte because he passed some articles, some items that were illegal, and then that was part of also, and he wrote about that in the Corriere della Sera. And by the way, the Corriere della Sera was selling thousands of more copies when Malaparte was publishing his own articles, because of course the people there in Italy, who probably was a kind of disillusioned with the war, was reading between the lines what was really happening behind propaganda. And in the same page, you had prominent writers that then became like Montanelli, an archenemy of Malaparte, like the voice of moderate Italy in the 60s and 70s and so on and so forth. So you really have a writer that is entangled with the most cosmopolitan and also the most local situation all over Europe. I had the sentences here, I don't want to make it longer, but by Jean Cocteau, another great writer of the 20th century who was a close friend of Malaparte, and they exchanged exquisite letters. So, and also if you happen to go to, this is for the graduate students maybe, but if you're interested in knowing more about the 20th century, all the letters he exchanged with the great writers, also with Henry Miller, just to quote one, the letter with Henry Miller is in the Italian version of this biography. You really see a personality that is connected, again, ambitious enough to be always in the wrong place in the right moment.
Well, one of the most extraordinary things about reading books like The Skin or Kaputt is that this connects to what Franco was now saying. At times, the reader wonders how the events present on page could possibly be, right? But I think that in Malaparte's poetics, this is actually a crucial feature, right? Malaparte is really trying to convey what it means to be living a world where standard categories of sense-making are just tossed out of the window, with the widespread destruction that he was chronicling, journeying through the horrors with his fabulations, mystifications of World War II. And so there is something fascinating about giving to the reader a sense of what it would mean to be exposed to stuff that cannot possibly be. But as a matter of fact, many of the events that Malaparte writes about happened. And so here lies one of the most important elements about his style, as he crosses so often the boundaries between facts and fiction. It's really also about questioning how certain events can happen in the first place. Before opening up to the public, and I will thank in advance the students helping us with the roaming microphones, I wanted to ask Maurizio a last question. So Maurizio, we're talking about Curzio Malaparte in the United States. And Malaparte traveled extensively, right, to Russia, to China, and so on and so forth. He never quite made it to the US, but he had some plans for it, right?
Yes, some plans. Some were completely absurd, like touring in a bicycle via United States and report that to the Corriere dello Sport. But some others were more serious. He had understood that a great period of European literature basically ended with the Second World War, and that the shift in international literature was going towards the state. There has been already the first move that was after the First World War, but then it was the American, the Hemingway, the Scott Fitzgerald, that came to Europe. The second was the move of the European writers going towards the state. And had he lived longer, I think he would have definitely tried this new phase. China and the United States were certainly for him, China politically interested him a lot. and communist China. And on the other hand, the United States of that new technology of literature, the new place of the intellectual and the writer in the most advanced system, a capitalist system in the world. Another, if you want, typical contradiction of Malaparte between the two elements, but quite interesting. I would like to terminate, if I may, on one sentence. We have laughed a bit in our little conversation, and there are laughable elements, definitely. But I would like to convey the exact meaning that Malaparte is one of the most tragic writers of the 20th century. There isn't, if not really at the end, he was a very good photographer, and his photographies, for instance, of Chinese children, are one of the very few rays of hope that exist in his work. He has a tragic vision of the condition humaine, of la condizione umana. There is not even that hope that comes from adhering one way or the other to an ideology. Man is alone, man is lost. There is also another element that is interesting in his behavioral pattern to modernity. He's a completely asexual author. No, but this is not laughable. There has been elements in trying to depict him as a closet homosexual, as a hidden. The fact is that he doesn't believe in human relation brought on that level. Everything has to deal with that coldness, almost voyeuristic and sometimes sadistic reproduction of human nature in motion, in which he doesn't seem to take part. This is the core element, I think, of Malapartism.
Coldness be my God. On that note, perhaps we can open it up to the public. We have one question there. I know that there should be, perhaps we can use one of these microphones so that, no. Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. And the second.
So mine is not really a question. I am the son of Franco Vegliani, that is mentioned very well in the book. My father was the first biographer of Curzio Malaparte. He was a young journalist at Il Tempo Illustrato that was in Milano, not in Rome. Sorry for. And Malaparte chose he. But my father was at Il Tempo Illustrato, and where Malaparte was columnist. He was a weekly magazine inspired at Life. Also, the La Testata was similar to Life. And Malaparte chose my father to be at the hospital where he were recovered, to tell him what to write in his name. And so I'm from 59, so I was born, then Malaparte was already died, but was a big part of my life, the story, because my father was so proud that he was, Malaparte chose him for that, and also he was a witness of all people that went to the hospital to say hello to him, and so, firstly, thank you, because you mentioned my father in the book. And another stuff really strange is that my father went to meet Daria Guarnati. And she was in Malcesine on Garda Lake, and my father, that was from Dalmatia, chose to buy a piece of land and build a house because Malcesine on Garda Lake remember him Dalmatia. So that is it's not a question, but I'm proud. Every time there is something about Malaparte, I love to follow and listen. And so, and the fact that Malaparte became so popular in US, it's very strange.
We shall see.
I have to go away. You know, I was the first to speak because I had to go away immediately. So thank you so much.
Ambassador Serra, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to this book. I have actually read it with great difficulty in other languages, so I'm looking forward actually to reading it this time. And you and I actually swapped emails, and I will say that you do in the past, because I reviewed, I began with a review of the skin, and then it began at 800 words and ended up at over 3,000. And the only person who could give me any clarity at all as to what was going on was your book. So thank you for that. My question for you is that the book came out in 2011. I don't know whether this is, I have the copy, but I haven't yet read it. Is this updated or? Because what's new since then?
Yes, first of all, thank you for your kind words. This is perhaps a precision that it's worth for our public here. The book came at a particularly felicitous moment because the archives of Malaparte had been closed for basically decades since his death, for particular reasons connected also with the family, with the heirs, mostly with them. So nobody could have access of it. Unfortunately, unfortunately, and this has been the crux of all the students of Malaparte in the 60s and 70s, that is after his death, and even later, one of the sisters was the closest sister to him, had this idea of selecting materials from the archive and publish them in an auto-published edition, 12 big volumes, in which she has certainly did the good thing of allowing certain materials to be known to the public. But at the same time, by selecting, she cut and pasted also and eliminated what she thought was not in the best memory of the brother. The result is that this material, once the archives have been opened in 2011, and I happen to be, of sheer circumstance, the first to see, really, to open the crates in this foundation of Milan that had bought it, we could really place all the mistakes, all the errors, and all the voluntary misinterpretation and quotation that she did herself concerning particularly the political attitudes, concerning sentimental life or non-life. So that has created around the legend of Malaparte a particular difficult approach on what was in terms of truth conceivable. I would say that from 2011 there has been another complex story because the archives have been closed again, because the commune of Prato, his native town, wanted to acquire them, didn't have the money. I mean, it's a long Italian story. So they have been closed for a certain number of years, and relatively few scholars after that have had access to these, Franco being one of them. Now the situation is much better because these archives have been systematically and scientifically ordered. So any student and any scholar, and that's the reason why we can have this selected edition of the work where, I mean, Adelphi has done through the people that have worked on the different books, made that serious edition, which we didn't have for years. Having said so, great improvement in these last years, I have to say that since I have perhaps the ambition to have seen what was essentially in those materials, sometimes this, with the work of deciphering, because there was probably obviously connected with the handwriting, and I mean, Every scholar knows that sort of things. I wouldn't say that many new things have appeared. On some, I'm skeptical. For instance, I'm skeptical on the new edition of the Kremlin Ball because I think it has been assembling various pieces of various periods. I'm not so sure that it is. But we have to consider always the fate of works that appear after the death of a writer. And sometimes the posthumous assembling of various drafts of the same piece create that sort of concerns. But on the whole, I think that I think Franco agrees and Andrea, we have a good picture now of his production.
Absolutely. One thing that we can add is the fact that a book like this kind of prompted more research for scholars, especially younger scholars. There are now scholars, I would say, in the entire world now interested in Malaparte. The other day I was talking with a graduate student from UCLA who studied Malaparte extensively. And the good thing is that after opening up this archive, in which you find correspondence, you realize that there is a lot of other archives of writers in Rome, in other parts of Italy, that wrote letters to Malaparte. Translators also, because in the 30s, Malaparte was like really a powerhouse for the editorial world in Italy. His journal Prospettive, Perspectives, was one of the best modernist journals, I would say, in Europe. I always say this, what is important is that writers like Joyce wrote for Prospettive. And in fact, the first snippet of a translation of Finnegan's Wake in Italian was in Malaparte's journal Prospettive, translated by Joyce himself. Who translated himself in Italian. So these kind of things look like minutiae. They are not, because in the late 30s, Italy, having this situation where possible only because of Malaparte's connection with powers, but also of his good taste and brio.
Something that perhaps I will add is that if there is a place where even the Italian versions of Malaparte can be somewhat shaky, is when Malaparte code switches to a different language. For instance, in the Italian version of Diary of a Foreigner in Paris, certain passages that in the original copy that we have at the archives are in French, are rendered in Italian. Now, this is something that may not seem to be a crucial element, but Malaparte was a very well-read author, and so his use of the French language at times is a direct quotation of French authors, and the direct quotation, of course, gets lost in the translation. And I know that Stephen had to massage some of those parts, as the Diary of a Foreigner in Paris contains parts in French as well. I don't know if you want to add anything on that, or if we...
Maybe just to say that, yeah, that something missed in some of the reviews, and an important point there. It was not finished, but the Italian version says this book was written mainly in Italian with a little bit of French, which we have translated into Italian. The French version that came out says this book was written mainly in French with a little bit in Italian, which we have translated into French, and so there is not any complete version. And so I was comparing the two and trying to get the best version. Yeah.
On this one word. This is again Malaparte, because although he was very gifted in, I would say, spreading some foreign words, also there is a rather dramatic use of foreign words. For instance, in one of the terrible chapter in Kaputt of the pogrom in Iasi, that Capitanul, so that captain that comes back as an effect which is really dramatic. Yet he had a gift also for the music of the words. Having said that, his only language was Italian. All his French texts have been revised by a professional translator. He gave, for instance, the idea the technique du coup d'etat had been written in French. Yes, it had been written in French and entirely revised by Juliette Bertrand. And since Juliette Bertrand said it, he never wanted to talk to her anymore in his life.
Andrea, scusa.
Yes.
Just two observations. The first one is that regarding one of the most puzzling aspects of his life, that is the switching party, right? And I'm not the defense attorney of Malaparte. He doesn't need me, and he never paid me. But I can say that it was a common thread of many Italian intellectuals of the time. Think of Moravia, think of Silone, and think in the film world, people like Rossellini and so on. The idea of refashioning who you were and who you'd have been by selecting the memories was a very common practice. And what I would say is that Malaparte was in your face. He didn't seem to shy away. When everybody was trying to put under the rug whatever they had done, he flaunted it. And he reminded me of the closing line of a great American film, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And the editor of this newspaper closes and says, "This is the South. When legend becomes fact, print the legend." And I think that's what Malaparte did. He made the legend into facts, and he printed the legend. And then I have a personal question for you, Ambassador. We are in a time in which literature is constantly under attack. Our chair here has to fight to keep the same number of professors, to demonstrate that what we do is not irrelevant. And the two voices that recently have come up in defense of literature, very much what sounds like a text of the humanist in the 15th century, are the Pope, who in July wrote a beautiful letter on the need to teach literature, the need to read fiction, novels, stories, and the voice of an ambassador. And so the very personal question to you is that if you could tell us how being a scholar of literature made you also a better diplomat or a different kind of diplomat. Thank you.
Less bad diplomat. By the way, I'm a former diplomat. Well, that's obviously a very tempting question that I would like to answer easily yes in my case. I think one element plays a role. And I will tell you an example that doesn't concern me, and I count for nothing, but concern a great Italian personality, a banker. I will not quote him, a gentleman now in his mid-90s, and he disclosed one of the great, I would say, financial crimes of Italy in the 70s, of which there were many, but that was probably the most relevant. And I happened to meet him at the time, and I asked him, avvocato, but not that avvocato. It was, no. That avvocato was slightly involved too. But, no, it was another avvocato. It was the liquidatore of the Banco Ambrosiano, okay. And I asked him, what is particularly that has triggered, I wouldn't say, obviously, it was a very naive question in the sense that there was an enormous work, the red tape involved in all this research. They had a team where they worked for years. And the answer to me, I don't know what it is, but what I know for sure is that at 14, I was 14, 15, when I read Dostoevsky. And that has helped me a lot in my work.
Thank you. No, wait for the mic.
I hope this is the appropriate forum. The Italian government announced that it was going to send its secondary students on trips to concentration camps recently. What can you say about this?
I think
Will it help?
Is it a question for me? But I think it has been going on for years. It has been going on for years. It may not be particularly by the government, but certainly, for instance, Rome, the town where I live, the Comune of Rome as permanent that sort, sometimes involving the Lord Mayor himself and so on. So I don't think that it is a novelty. I think that it is obviously a particularly important and essential part of education at large. But as I say, I don't think that it is as new as that.
Thank you. We've been chatting primarily about the literary aspects of Malaparte, but I wanted to maybe ask your thoughts on some political aspects, especially in light of this sort of upswing in, right-wing political movements in Europe. Does he have any relevance to them? Do they talk about him? Sort of that sort of thing.
Franco, I don't know.
Okay, it happened to me after conferences. They were talking about Malaparte, and then some people from the public came and say, "I know you're one of us." And it was very creepy. I was like, no, I got to go to the bathroom, stuff like that. So these things happen in Italy, yes. However, Malaparte was the kind of person that a certain kind of right wing doesn't like. Doesn't like because it was a turncoat for that. It was not consistent with the dictum of a nation and so on and so forth. There's so many things going on. And of course, a lot of the right-wing people don't like a figure that's so flamboyant and so cosmopolitan, on one hand. On another hand, his books are so full, are so variegated with possibilities, with characters from the right and also from the left. And he doesn't shy away from shortcomings and qualities on both sides. In Kaputt, there is a journalist that is called a stupido fascista, a stupid fascist throughout, but as a matter of fact, he's the only person who saves lives in a pogrom in Romania. So this is also the complexity of Malaparte, and why Malaparte also is so difficult to read today and to accept, because it doesn't fit in the categories that we would like to have for given history. A book like Kaputt, a book like La Pelle, they really open up questions when you read them. They might be misleading in your better intentions. It might be like tough to read from ideological reason. That's also true. But as we were discussing before, the recent publication or republication, because these books were available, even shortened, even censored, but were available to the American reading public for decades. The recent republication by New York Review of Books allowed a confrontation with the text that really can open up a strong discussion on what was the common past during Second World War, during fascism, and in the aftermath of that.
And if I may add something, Malaparte was an atypical man, also insofar as three of the characteristics that underpinned his life. Talking about the coherence of this apparently incoherent man, he was anti-clerical throughout, for most part. There is a very strong strain of anti-bourgeois thrust in his work. And the third point, perhaps Maurizio will disagree with me, I think that Malaparte always remained a Republican at heart. So this is a clearly an atypical figure, even in the pantheon of right-wing authors. The obvious term of comparison here, which is a flawed term of comparison, is the French author Louis-Ferdinand Céline. Malaparte, of course, never wrote anything as vitriolic, such as certain of his pamphlets and so on and so forth.
About the we have to forget he never was anti-Semitic. Right. Never. So this is a point. No, I honestly, since I work a lot on the right-wing intellectuals of the 20th century, I hardly see his name in conjunction, quoted in conjunction with Céline or others of that walk of literature. So I wouldn't consider him entering into that category, even as a posthumous title.
Yeah, in a sort of similar vein, you've mentioned the recent resurgence in American interest in Malaparte, of course, in part thanks to NYRB, but I can also think of several contextual reasons for that as well. And I'm curious if you could speak to the ways in which this new translation of your biography and a new reading of Malaparte's work in light of this biography could perhaps illuminate the mechanics of fascism or even literature under fascism uniquely for an American audience who may be perhaps less familiar with that, but also in great need of that at this time. Thank you.
Perhaps Franco can say something about the American landscape on this, and
Okay.
and I will follow you.
Well, of course, it's difficult to speak about Malaparte in the United States, but as a writer, here it was definitely not part of the canon. Again, in one of my classes, I have to push the library of Bard College where I teach to order Kaputt, which is probably his masterpiece because it's never been ordered elsewhere in the other colleges in the United States. It's a 700 pages book. It's difficult to read. It's tough to read, but it's possibly one of the most influential books on Second World War published. Full stop, published in general, because there are so many other writers that took snippets, atmospheres, even turn of phrases of his style and of his content, and created, not to say careers, but at least interpretation of Second World War based on his work. I mean, some years ago, I remember an interesting conference, writers on the Eastern Front. There was a Vasily Grossman on one side, amazing Jewish writer, the first writer who entered Treblinka, and on the other side there was Malaparte. And then there's a confrontation that is not just ideological, but really, really literally speaking, extremely engrossing, because you see how these writers were on opposite side. They could really be aware of the humanity, of the creaturely life that was wasted on the front in totally different manners.
Perhaps before I give the mic to Maurizio, the text that I think here should be read in English is his Technique du coup d'etat. There, Malaparte, to make a very long story short, analyzes certain common features in coup d'etat in modern history, and he finds, or he argues, that the distinguishing feature of the successful coup d'etat is that there is a small contingent of forces that take over power. So a small and elite contingent of very motivated forces. That is a text, in my opinion, that could be rediscovered in the current climate.
Yes, that's exactly the reason why after the four that have been translated or retranslated or republished, we should suggest the New York Review of Books to do Technique du coup d'etat, because it's an extraordinary modern text. It is known that Che Guevara and Fidel Castro read it in the jungle. It is possibly known also that the Viet Cong adopted it as a text. It's a small book. It's a book of less than 200 pages, extremely readable, not a scientific treatise, but as you say, it has this conception of the elitist coup d'etat, that is a small group of people. And then there is a strange story around it, because in the last chapter, Umi added, it was written in France, and he thought that since it was the first moment that Hitler had gone to power, the book was mainly written between 32 and 33. You know what happened in Germany in January 33. So at the moment, Mussolini disliked intensely Hitler because he envied him in a way, but at the same time, he thought I would become number two after him, and that's what, in a certain way, happened. He had already understood that. So in order to please the perception of Mussolini as the virile leader of Europe who had done the coup d'etat with the March of Rome, literally were apparently being inspired, which was certainly not the case, by the idea of that technique du coup d'etat: speed, force, action, pragmatism, no concern with ideologies, short titles, that sort of thing. He decided to make a chapter that apparently may be something that, as I say, the champion of the Roman virility would have appreciated. And the chapter on Hitler started with "Hitler is a woman." Now, that was not something that was, I would say, without a certain psychological insight, not because Hitler was a woman, because what he wanted to say was that it is permeated by a conception of a power which is definitely the different conception compared to the Roman civilization. And this is the approach which made that the book was banned in Italy and was not published. But it's interesting because lots of scholars of Hitlerism, in particular, if you have seen the 7 hours film of Züberberg, Hitler and Deutsches Verein, German Destiny, come back to that point.
Just as a cameo to what you said about taking the coup d'etat, and of course it should be translated, and I would say retranslated, because at Bar College where I teach, we are lucky we have the library of Hannah Arendt. And Technique du coup d'etat is one of the few books from Italian authors that is in Hannah Arendt's library. I think there are big reasons for that.
Well, so if I remember briefly, yes, Technique du coup d'etat was translated to English almost immediately, like within the year. It exists, but I had to go very deep in the stacks of the University of Chicago Library to find it. You know, the very dusty old edition that it may well could lend itself to a retranslation. But to try to speak in a little coda to the question, almost one, I just want to say there's in a way there's something that's not about the zeitgeist in this interest in Malaparte, because again, NYRB Books started publishing, republished Kaputt in 2005, Skin in 2013. When I was working on that, in fact, it felt so removed. It was in these like placid Obama years in which I could like safely think fascism was this like threat way in the past. It's felt very different to continue working on the author with the passage of time. But this is also an interest that has been building over years. And this biography project, again, the spark was in 2020. It's only happens to be published now, but this is really kind of a long time coming. But of course, it comes out now. It easily can prompt reflection on its relevance. And I also just wonder if it's worth looking at him as in a way, untimely figure, because he is not, for all that I wanted to make a case for, like, we should not forget his real, like, active, enthusiastic engagement with fascism for over 2 decades. And yet, it was such a different thing. This is not to make an apology for him, but to be a fascist at the beginning, when you're making up, the word's just been made up. This is, at the time, proposed as a revolutionary movement. Both Mussolini and Malaparte had serious sympathies with workers. As we know, Mussolini was a socialist. Things go wrong. He really, we don't like, what Malaparte did for the fascist party, and yet he is following a path. He's trying to advance himself. He can't help it. He wants to be the center of attention. This is the game that's in town right now. However, I think it's a whole other matter in our current period to reach back into history and identify with fascism after we know everything, after how badly it ended. That is, in a way, a more damnable act to me, to reach back and say, no, I want to reaffirm this thing now that we know how badly it ended. Malaparte didn't know that. He was still living, in the midst of it. Fascism was not historical to him.
We have time for one last question.
Yes, I find this fascinating. I'm an architect, and I've admired the Casa Malaparte at Capri since forever. And of course, it fits with the design of that building, because apparently Malaparte went into conflict with the architect who had an original design for it, and he ended up building it himself. So I'm wondering how that building reflects his personality, his way of looking at the world, his way of working, his values, in light of everything you've said.
I think that you're absolutely right. The building is what he considered to be his portrait in stone. So it is completely Malaparte, and he has not designed it. There has been a long dispute. I devoted a part of that research. Libera, the architect, was the real... but he had made changes to the plans of Libera, because he had certainly a certain visual I would say instinct. Obviously didn't have the tools of the architect. Well, to that there is an element of which one can, it's again a bit of a legend, of Malaparte legend, a bit of a legend. Having said so, I had the privilege to sleep one night, courtesy to the, and believe you me, it was one of the longest nights and nightmarish life of my life. I remember calling my wife in order to be pampered, but then the mobile didn't work because it's absolutely nightmarish. He wanted it to be the most uncomfortable place on earth, and it is. He wanted it to have this. First of all, he never wanted to be called a villa, because a villa is, for the moment of one, is as a sort of piece, and that was a casamata of the First World War. And in fact, with the exception of that immense veranda in the first floor, the rooms are tiny, with little windows, bow windows, and as I say, it made everything in order to make it very uncomfortable to the few people who in his lifetime went there, besides the fact that there is no access really to the house. But it is uncomfortably, there is undoubtedly Malapartian.
One can try to break in. Anyway, on that note, thank you so much, Franco, Stephen, and Maurizio, of course.